Welcome back to my channel, and I am back with another 15 true scary stories to fall asleep to. Make sure to like and subscribe. Lay back, relax, and let's get right into it. When Eleanor Ravenswood inherited Wraithmore Manor, she knew little of her family's haunted past. Growing up, she had been shielded from tales of her ancestors' strange dealings and misfortunes. But from the moment she stepped onto the property, a gnawing dread gripped her, an inexplicable fear that made the very air seem charged with something dark and unnatural. She chalked it up to her overactive imagination, for she was, after all, finally home. The manor itself was a Gothic behemoth, towering over the foggy moors with an oppressive air of decay and grandeur. It had been left untouched for nearly a century, frozen in time, still holding relics and remnants of the family's past. Eleanor had always found history fascinating, and the manor, with its winding corridors and ominous staircases, was a historian's dream come true. But as night fell on her first day, an eerie feeling began to settle in. Eleanor explored cautiously, a candle flickering in her hand, casting dancing shadows along the walls. The house creaked and groaned as if it were alive, and she could swear the shadows moved of their own accord, reaching for her with greedy, spectral fingers. In one of the upper bedrooms, she found an ancient painting, draped in a sheet, and carefully lifted the cover to reveal a portrait of a woman with piercing eyes that seemed to follow her with an unsettling intelligence. Her mother had always mentioned their family history in fragments, often mentioning an ancestor who had disappeared. But Eleanor had never seen a portrait of her, until now. It was that night Eleanor heard the first whispers. In the deepest hours of night, when the world was silent and still, a faint voice drifted through the halls, a whisper so soft she thought she imagined it. She held her breath, listening. Eleanor, it called, soft but insistent. She tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was the house settling or the wind. But as the night wore on, the voice grew louder, filling the silence with a persistent hum that tugged at her mind, urging her to follow. The next day, Eleanor found herself drawn to the library, an expansive room lined floor to ceiling with dusty tomes, each one holding secrets that had been hidden for generations. As she wandered the shelves, her fingers brushed over a particularly ancient, leather-bound book. Its title had been worn away by time, and when she opened it, a chill ran down her spine. Inside, she found page after page of her family's dark history, accounts of deals made with forces she could hardly comprehend, of disappearances, of madness that seeped into the Ravenswood bloodline. There was mention of a hidden room, a place known only as the Vault, rumored to be where the family's darkest relics were kept. But the book also hinted at a curse, one that had been placed on the Ravenswoods by a scorned lover who had vanished into the moors centuries ago. Her great-great-grandmother, Lady Cordelia Ravenswood, was said to have dabbled in dark magic, a practitioner of forbidden rites that were only whispered about in hushed tones. She had supposedly angered the spirits of the moors, leaving the family forever cursed to live with the specters they had disturbed. Eleanor's heart pounded as she read, feeling the weight of her ancestors' sins pressed down upon her. She had come to Wraithmore Manor to find herself, but she was beginning to fear that the person she was becoming wasn't truly herself. Determined to find the hidden room, Eleanor spent the next week scouring the house. She traced her hands over every wall, checking for secret panels or hidden passages. Her search finally led her to a dusty, forgotten alcove behind the library, where she found a narrow staircase spiraling downward into the depths of the manor. As she descended, the air grew colder, and an almost suffocating silence enveloped her. At the bottom, she found a thick, iron door etched with symbols she could not read. With a trembling hand, she pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale and thick with an indescribable sense of malevolence. Shelves lined the walls, filled with strange artifacts. A cracked mirror, a small porcelain doll with one eye missing, and a stack of letters, yellowed with age. As she thumbed through the letters, her eyes widened. They were written by Lady Cordelia herself, detailing her descent into madness and obsession with an ancient being she referred to as the Watcher. One passage caught Eleanor's eye, chilling her to the bone. The Watcher came to me in dreams, showing me visions of the other side. His eyes are endless, a void that sees all and consumes all. I have given him what he asks, and in return, he has granted me knowledge and power. But I fear the cost, for he whispers to me still, even when I am awake. From that night on, Eleanor's dreams were filled with haunting visions. She saw glimpses of the moors, shrouded in a supernatural mist that seemed alive, pulsating with an unnatural energy. Figures moved in the fog, shadowy forms that reached for her, their hollow eyes filled with hunger. One night, as she tossed and turned, she was jolted awake by a soft tapping sound. Her heart raced, and she sat up, straining to hear. Tap, tap, tap. The sound seemed to come from inside the walls, creeping closer, as if something or someone was crawling within. As she listened, the tapping grew louder, morphing into a scratching, scraping sound that seemed to surround her. Panicked, she leapt from the bed and fled down the hall, the sound following her, filling the corridors with an unrelenting, bone-chilling persistence. Finally, she reached the main hall, breathless and trembling, only to find the portrait of the woman, the same one she had seen her first night, hanging there, her painted eyes blazing with unnatural fury. And this time, the woman seemed to smile. Days turned into weeks, and Eleanor's grip on reality began to slip. She barely slept, haunted by the feeling that something watched her every move, lurking in the corners of her vision. She tried to leave the manor, but every time she approached the gate, an invisible force seemed to pull her back, whispering to her, lulling her into a trance. Desperate, she turned back to the book she had found in the library. She began to read the rituals inscribed within, drawn to a spell that promised to reveal the identity of the Watcher. But as she began the incantation, a darkness settled over her, filling her mind with voices, each one echoing her name, over and over again until it became a cacophony of madness. That night, as the final words left her lips, a figure emerged from the shadows, its eyes like endless pits of darkness, reflecting no light, only an abyss. It reached out to her with skeletal hands, and Eleanor felt her soul being pulled from her body, her consciousness fading as she stared into the black, consuming void of the Watcher. The last thing she heard was its voice, low and menacing, filling her mind with an ancient promise. "You are mine, Eleanor," as they all were. Years later, new residents moved into the manor, oblivious to the horrors that lay in its walls. But the moors still whispered, and on quiet nights, those who dared venture near could still hear Eleanor's voice, calling from within, begging for release. And those who listened too closely found themselves trapped, ensnared by the same curse, for the Watcher was always hungry, and the Ravenswood family was far from finished. In time, Eleanor became another shadow, another voice calling from the dark, and the cycle continued, a living nightmare that would never end. The Ravenswoods remain haunted, their lineage forever bound to Wraithmore Manor. Each generation is marked by tragedy, each descendant succumbing to the lure of the Watcher, and each one joins the chorus of voices that haunt the moors, trapped in a realm of eternal darkness. And even now, the townsfolk warn travelers to stay away from Wraithmore, for those who listen too closely may find themselves lost, hearing the same whispered invitation, "Come to me, come to the shadows." For centuries, the secluded village of Dread Hollow existed only in whispers and rumors, a place on the edge of Blackthorn Woods that locals warned travelers never to visit. There were stories of disappearances, of strangers who came seeking shelter only to be swallowed by the village and never seen again, of strange rites performed in secret, and a spirit, known only as the Veiled Lady, who roamed the woods and the village under cover of darkness. This was a village marred by tragedy, where curses ran as deep as the roots of the ancient trees. But curiosity drove Emma there. She'd read about the village, the hauntings, and the warnings that surrounded it in all the old tales, and was drawn to them like a moth to a flame, convinced she'd find nothing but superstition. Yet, as she neared the village on a cold autumn evening, a thick, unnatural fog began to drift over the road, consuming the headlights of her car and reducing the world outside to a wall of impenetrable gray. Her heart raced as she tightened her grip on the wheel. The closer she got to the village, the thicker the fog grew, curling around her car like ghostly fingers. Finally, her car rolled to a stop at what appeared to be the outskirts of Dread Hollow. The village lay silent and still, shrouded in mist so dense that even the few lights from nearby windows seemed to barely flicker through it. She stepped out, her footsteps crunching against the damp gravel as she took in her surroundings. The houses were small, squat, and huddled together as though seeking comfort. Every door was bolted shut, windows covered with thick, dark curtains that seemed to muffle the very light. Despite the silence, the air hummed with tension, as if the village itself were watching her, waiting. She took a few tentative steps forward, her eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of life. But what she saw instead were strange symbols etched into doorways, fences, and even on the ground beneath her feet. Symbols she didn't recognize, drawn in jagged lines and loops that seemed to spiral inward, drawing her attention and making her feel dizzy, as though something unseen were tugging at her mind. She turned her head sharply, certain she'd heard footsteps. The sound was faint, soft, as if someone were trailing her. She spun around, but the street behind her was empty, just the ever-present fog swallowing the path. She called out, her voice sounding weak and thin, but no reply came. Ignoring her rising panic, she continued further into the village, heading toward a central square she could just make out through the mist. And that was when she saw it. A lone building, taller and more foreboding than the others, its walls stained with age and ivy creeping over its facade, seeming to pull the building down into the earth. A decaying wooden sign, barely readable, revealed it to be the village chapel. Something about it felt wrong. Its sharp, gabled roof jutting into the mist, its boarded windows that hid whatever horrors lay inside. She shivered as a chill ran down her spine, but something compelled her forward, an invisible pull she couldn't resist. As she moved closer to the chapel doors, she noticed the faint outline of a figure standing in the doorway, cloaked in shadow. Her heart pounded, and every instinct screamed at her to run, yet she felt rooted to the spot. The figure lifted a thin, pale hand and beckoned her forward. Its movement was slow, deliberate, a silent command she couldn't defy. She moved closer, her body unwillingly following the figure's silent summons. With each step, the air grew colder, and her breaths became shallow gasps as she approached. Finally, she stood before the chapel door. The figure, now gone, had disappeared into the darkness within. She reached out and, with trembling fingers, pushed the heavy wooden door open. It groaned, a low, echoing sound that seemed to travel through the entire village, stirring some unseen presence around her. Inside, the air was thick and damp, cloying with the smell of old wax, wet stone, and something foul and earthy. Weak candles burned along the walls, barely casting enough light to see beyond a few steps. Taking a shaky breath, she ventured deeper, her every movement slow, cautious, and filled with dread. In the center of the room, she spotted an altar shrouded in dust and shadows. On it lay a rotting, ancient book with brittle, yellowed pages filled with the same jagged symbols she'd seen outside. Beside the book was a glass case containing a tattered, lace veil that looked as though it hadn't been touched in centuries. Its intricate lace pattern seemed woven with strange symbols that sent a chill through her as she stared at them. She felt compelled to reach out to the veil, but something about the case, the way the lace seemed to shimmer as though alive, rooted her in place. The legend of the veiled lady flashed through her mind. A spirit said to be bound to the village after a failed wedding rite. A soul trapped forever in mourning and searching for the life she'd lost. The veiled lady, she realized, wasn't just a ghost haunting the village. She was a remnant of an ancient pact, a being that demanded sacrifice in exchange for the village's safety, an endless tribute of souls to keep her from devouring all of Dread Hollow. It was then that Emma noticed her own reflection in the glass, and what she saw made her blood run cold. It wasn't her face. In the reflection, her features had changed to a hollow, sunken version of herself, her eyes vacant, as if staring into the void. Her reflection wore the veil, and the lace clung to her face, pulling her skin tight, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. She stumbled backward, her breath shallow, but as she moved, the shadows around her seemed to shift and pulse, closing in as though to hold her in place. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw the pale figure again, hovering at the edge of the candlelight. Its eyes were hollow and dark, staring directly at her, yet somehow lifeless and filled with an infinite sorrow. It moved toward her, one slow step at a time, extending its hand toward her. Before she could scream, she felt a chill seep into her skin, as if icy fingers were pressing into her bones, rooting her to the spot. A voice whispered in her ear, soft but filled with an ancient malice. "Join me," it breathed, each word dripping with a hunger that seemed to pierce her soul. She tried to move, to run, but her legs were frozen, her body paralyzed by an invisible force. She could feel something wrapping around her, a weight pressing down, as if she were sinking into the floor, her vision dimming as the veil in the case began to pulse with an eerie, spectral glow. Her vision blurred, and the last thing she saw was the figure lowering the veil over her face, its icy lace pressing against her skin, sealing her fate. When the villagers emerged from their homes at dawn, they found the door to the chapel wide open and the veil missing, though Emma's car remained parked just outside the village. They whispered among themselves, their faces pale, for they knew what had happened. Another sacrifice had been claimed. From that day forward, it was said that the spirit of the veiled lady grew stronger, and anyone who dared to enter the village alone would feel her presence, a shadowy figure in the mist, with her pale, empty eyes fixed upon them, beckoning them deeper into the darkness. Now, locals say the veiled lady is no longer confined to the chapel but roams the village and the edges of Blackthorn Woods, her sorrowful whispers heard on quiet nights, her icy fingers felt by anyone who lingers too long, urging them to join her among the lost souls of Dread Hollow. In the heart of the Cimmerian Pines, an old, abandoned mansion loomed like a specter of its former self. Known as Blackwood House, it had stood for centuries, nestled deep in the forest, forgotten by the world beyond. Its tall, foreboding towers were cracked and crumbling, and ivy had claimed the outer walls, wrapping around them like chains. Local legends claimed the place was cursed, haunted by the spirit of a woman named Lillian, who was said to wander the halls at night, forever searching for something she had lost. It was said she had vanished without a trace one winter night, and ever since, anyone who dared enter Blackwood House would hear her soft, mournful voice calling from the shadows. Elise had heard the stories since she was a child, and she'd always scoffed at them, convinced that the house was nothing more than an old ruin. But when her grandfather passed away, leaving her the deed to the property, she decided to visit Blackwood House herself, more out of curiosity than anything else. She arrived on a cold, gray afternoon, the sky thick with clouds that threatened snow. As she approached, the air seemed to grow colder, and a sense of unease crept over her. The silence was unnatural, as if the entire forest held its breath. She brushed it off as nerves and pushed open the massive front door, which groaned on its hinges, echoing through the empty halls. Inside, the mansion was even darker than she'd imagined. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick and stale, carrying the faint scent of decayed wood and something else she couldn't identify. Something sharp and metallic. The grand foyer opened up to a sweeping staircase that seemed to disappear into the darkness above. Shadows clung to every corner, and as she looked around, she couldn't shake the feeling that the walls themselves were watching her, hiding secrets that had been buried for centuries. She took a deep breath and began her exploration, her footsteps echoing in the hollow silence. As she wandered the halls, Elise noticed strange details about the house. There were portraits lining the walls, each one more unsettling than the last. The people in the paintings had hollow eyes, their faces frozen in expressions of grief or rage, and she could swear their gazes followed her as she moved. At the end of one corridor, she came across a door that looked different from the others, made of a dark wood that seemed almost untouched by time. She reached out to open it, but as soon as her fingers brushed the handle, a chill shot through her, and she pulled her hand back instinctively. It was then that she heard it, a soft, almost inaudible whisper that seemed to come from behind the door. "Help me." The voice was faint, almost childlike, and yet it carried a desperation that sent a shiver down her spine. Elise tried to tell herself it was just the wind, but something about the voice lingered in her mind, as if it had been etched into her thoughts. Against her better judgment, she pushed open the door. Inside was a small, dimly lit room with faded wallpaper and a single, dust-covered mirror hanging on the wall. As she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her, the sound reverberating through the silence. Her heart raced, and she felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. She turned to open the door, but it wouldn't budge, as though something on the other side held it firmly shut. Turning back to the room, she noticed something strange about the mirror. It didn't reflect the room as it was. Instead, it showed an image of the room as it might have looked 100 years ago, with rich, vibrant wallpaper and an ornate carpet covering the floor. And in the reflection, she saw a woman standing behind her, a woman with pale skin, hollow eyes, and long, dark hair that framed her face like a shadow. The woman's mouth opened, but instead of words, a low, guttural moan escaped her lips, filling the room with a sound that was both human and inhuman, as if it carried centuries of pain. Elise stumbled back, her pulse pounding as she tried to look away from the mirror, but her eyes seemed glued to it, unable to tear themselves from the figure behind her. The woman reached out a hand, her fingers long and skeletal, stretching toward Elise's shoulder. A surge of panic shot through her, and she spun around, only to find the room empty. But as she turned back to the mirror, the woman was still there, her hand now pressed against the glass, her hollow eyes filled with a strange, pleading look. "Help me," she whispered again, her voice thick with sorrow. Elise felt a pang of sympathy, though she couldn't explain why. There was something hauntingly familiar about the woman's face, as if she'd seen her before, in a half-remembered dream or an old photograph. She backed out of the room, her heart racing, but as she turned to leave, she found that the hallway she'd come from was gone. In its place was a narrow, winding corridor that stretched into darkness. Every instinct told her to turn back, to find another way, but something compelled her forward, as if an unseen force was guiding her deeper into the house. The walls seemed to close in around her, the air growing colder with each step. Shadows flickered along the walls, and she could swear she heard footsteps echoing just behind her, though every time she turned, the corridor was empty. After what felt like an eternity, she found herself in a grand, dimly lit ballroom, its once beautiful decorations now faded and tattered. The air was heavy with the scent of old perfume and something darker, something that smelled of earth and decay. In the center of the room stood a figure, her back turned to Elise. The woman's hair was long and dark, just like the figure in the mirror, and she wore a flowing, tattered gown that brushed the floor like mist. Elise felt her heart pound as the woman slowly turned to face her, revealing the same hollow eyes and sorrowful expression she had seen in the mirror. The woman stepped closer, her gaze fixed on Elise, and as she moved, her feet didn't touch the floor, as though she were gliding rather than walking. Her hand reached out, trembling, and she spoke in a voice that was barely more than a whisper. "He took it from me, my heart, my life." Her words trailed off into silence, and Elise felt a cold hand press against her own chest, just above her heart. A pain shot through her, sharp and sudden, as though something were being pulled from inside her. Elise tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. Her vision blurred, and she felt herself growing weaker, as if her very life were being drained from her. The woman's eyes grew darker, her gaze filled with an insatiable hunger. "You must stay. You belong here now," the woman whispered, her hand pressing harder against Elise's chest. In a final, desperate attempt, Elise tore herself away, stumbling back and gasping for breath. She turned to flee, but the ballroom had vanished, replaced by an endless, twisting labyrinth of corridors, each one darker and colder than the last. Her breaths came in shallow gasps as she wandered through the maze, her strength fading with every step. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, and she could feel the house closing in around her, trapping her in its clutches. Finally, she collapsed, her vision dimming, and as darkness claimed her, she heard the faint, mournful whisper of the woman's voice echoing in her mind. "You belong to Blackwood now." When the townsfolk came looking for Elise days later, they found the mansion empty, its rooms just as cold and decayed as before. But from that day on, those brave enough to venture into Blackwood House spoke of a new voice among the whispers, a voice filled with fear and sorrow, a voice calling for help, lost forever in the shadows. High in the mountains, isolated from civilization, there stood an old mining town called Greystone Hollow. Decades ago, it had thrived during the Silver Rush, but after a series of mysterious deaths, it was abandoned overnight, left to decay under the relentless winter snows. Local legends told of the miner's curse, a haunting that was said to plague any who dared venture into Greystone Hollow. They said the mountains held a power that corrupted the soul, and that the darkness within the mine had driven the last of its workers mad. No one had dared enter the hollow for years, until Victor decided he'd find out the truth for himself. Victor had always been drawn to ghost towns, the relics of forgotten history, and the stories they held. Greystone Hollow, with its whispered curses and stories of restless spirits, was exactly the kind of mystery he'd been looking for. He set out one cold autumn day, hiking up the rocky trails with only a flashlight, a map, and a small satchel of supplies. The trees grew sparse as he ascended, the mountain's rocky terrain swallowing the trail until he found himself standing at the edge of the hollow. It was nearly dusk, and the fading light bathed the town in an eerie glow. Broken buildings and rusted machinery lay scattered across the area like bones, remnants of a forgotten life. The wind howled through the empty streets, carrying with it a faint, metallic scent. He shivered, feeling an unexpected chill creep up his spine, but he pushed it aside. With each step, he felt as if the mountain itself were watching him, waiting. As he walked through the town, Victor noticed strange things. Faint footprints in the dust that seemed fresh, despite the years of abandonment. Doors slightly ajar, as if someone had passed through recently. Windows that seemed to reflect shadows even when no one stood near them. He brushed these off as tricks of his imagination, the result of his own anticipation building into paranoia. But then, he reached the mouth of the mine. the place the townsfolk had called the heart of the hollow, and something in him hesitated. The entrance was a yawning void, surrounded by weathered boards and chains that had long since rusted through. A cold, metallic scent seeped from within, thicker and sharper than the faint traces in the town itself. For a moment, he considered turning back, but curiosity pushed him forward. He took a deep breath, turned on his flashlight, and stepped into the darkness. Inside, the air was thick and stale, pressing in around him as though the mountain itself were swallowing him whole. His footsteps echoed off the narrow walls, and the shadows seemed to twist and writhe at the edges of his light. Old equipment lay scattered along the floor, half buried in the dirt, and the walls were scarred with claw-like marks that he guessed were the desperate strikes of pickaxes. As he ventured deeper, he began to notice something strange. Whispers, faint and fragmented, drifting from deeper within the mine. At first, he told himself it was the wind, or perhaps the creak of old beams settling. But as he moved further, the voices grew louder, more distinct, like a chorus of men muttering just out of sight. His flashlight flickered, and his heart raced as he tried to ignore the feeling that he was being watched. He rounded a corner and stumbled into a large, open cavern. The walls of the cavern were lined with strange markings, crude, jagged symbols scratched into the stone. They seemed to pulse in the darkness, and as he stared, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. He took a step forward, his eyes catching a glimmer of something buried in the dirt. Crouching down, he reached for it and unearthed a rusted silver locket. Its surface was tarnished, but when he opened it, he found a photograph inside, a faded image of a woman with haunted eyes, staring out as if she were looking directly at Hai. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and the whispers turned into a low, anguished moan that seemed to come from all around him. The walls of the cavern began to shake, dust and small rocks tumbling from above, and he felt a sharp, stabbing pain in his chest, as if an icy hand had reached into him, gripping his heart. He staggered back, clutching the locket, but when he looked down, it had vanished from his hand. Panic surged through him, and he turned to leave, but the entrance to the cavern had disappeared. In its place was a wall of solid rock, as if the mountain had closed in on itself, trapping him. He shone his flashlight around, desperate to find another way out, but the beam only revealed more jagged symbols carved into the walls, symbols that seemed to twist and writhe as he stared at them. And then he saw them, figures emerging from the shadows, pale and hollow-eyed, their faces frozen in expressions of fear and anguish. They wore tattered clothing, the remnants of miners' uniforms, and their mouths moved silently, as though crying out in pain. They began to close in, their hands outstretched, and he felt the icy grip tighten around his chest. He backed away, his heart pounding, but the figures kept advancing, their hollow eyes fixed on him with a hunger that defied understanding. He tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat, and he felt his vision blur as a wave of exhaustion washed over him. The last thing he saw was the face of one of the miners, mere inches from his own, its mouth twisted into a ghastly smile as it whispered, "Join us, the mountain hungers." When Victor's friends came searching for him days later, they found no trace of him, only his flashlight lying at the entrance to the mine, flickering weakly. They say that on quiet nights, if you listen closely near the mouth of Greystone Hollow, you can still hear the faint whispers of the miners, their voices forever bound to the heart of the mountain, and that if you're not careful, the mountain will claim you too, taking your soul to join the others lost forever in the darkness. Nestled deep in the heart of the old Evernight Woods, a mansion known as Ravenbrook Manor had stood for generations, hidden away from prying eyes and shrouded in rumors of dark, unexplainable events. Once the home of the Calloway family, it had been abandoned for nearly a century after the entire family vanished without a trace one stormy night. The locals believed the family was cursed, bound by a sinister force lurking within the manor's walls. Some said the house itself was alive, feeding on the fears of anyone who dared to enter. But despite these legends, Thomas, a historian obsessed with unraveling the manor's mysteries, decided to explore Ravenbrook Manor himself, determined to uncover the truth behind its dark history. He arrived just as dusk settled over the woods, the last rays of light casting long shadows that seemed to claw at the walls of the mansion. The iron gate creaked as he pushed it open, and he paused, feeling an odd weight in the air, as though something watched from the darkened windows above. Brushing off the feeling his nerves, he made his way up the overgrown path, each step muffled by the thick, damp moss. As he approached the front door, he noticed strange carvings etched into the wood, symbols he couldn't decipher, their patterns twisting and spiraling in ways that made his eyes ache. He reached out to touch them, but the moment his fingers brushed the carvings, a chill shot up his spine, and he heard a faint whisper just beyond the edge of hearing. Ignoring the sense of foreboding, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The air within was thick, stale, carrying the scent of mildew and something else, something sharp and bitter that stung his nose. Dust coated every surface, and the silence was so complete that even his softest footfalls seemed to echo endlessly. The entryway opened into a grand, sweeping staircase that spiraled into darkness above, its wooden railings twisted and warped as if they had been melted and refashioned by some unknown force. Paintings lined the walls, their colors faded, but the eyes of the figures within seemed to gleam with unnatural intensity, following him as he moved. As he ventured further into the house, he began to feel an uncomfortable pressure, as though the walls were slowly closing in. The temperature dropped, and his breath began to fog in front of him. He pulled his flashlight from his bag and turned it on, its beam slicing through the shadows, revealing rooms filled with decaying furniture and shattered glass. Yet, despite the emptiness, he could feel a presence, something lurking just beyond his sight. He brushed it off as his imagination, but the further he went, the stronger the feeling became. He entered a long hallway lined with mirrors, their surfaces clouded with age. As he passed each one, he noticed strange distortions in his reflection, shadows shifting behind him, flickers of movement that disappeared when he turned to look. In one mirror, he thought he saw a figure standing at the end of the hall, cloaked in darkness, watching him with hollow eyes. He turned quickly, his heart pounding, but the hallway was empty. He continued forward, each step feeling heavier than the last, as though the house itself resisted his presence. Finally, he reached the library, a vast room filled with shelves that stretched up to the high, vaulted ceiling. Books of all sizes and ages lined the walls, their spines covered in a thick layer of dust. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate desk, its surface littered with papers, quills, and a single candle that looked freshly melted, as if someone had been there recently. As he approached the desk, he noticed a book lying open, its pages filled with handwritten notes in a language he didn't recognize. The handwriting was shaky, desperate, as though the writer had been in a state of panic. He leaned closer, trying to decipher the symbols, but his vision began to blur, and a wave of dizziness washed over him. Just then, he heard a soft, raspy voice whispering his name, coming from somewhere within the walls. The voice was faint, almost pleading, filled with a sadness that made his skin crawl. He looked around, but the room was empty. Suddenly, the door to the library slammed shut, the sound echoing through the house. He ran to the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic began to set in as he banged against the door, shouting for help, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. Then he heard footsteps approaching from the other side, slow and deliberate, as though something, or someone, was drawing nearer. His heart raced as he pressed himself against the door, listening to the sound of shuffling feet and the faint whisper of fabric brushing against the floor. The footsteps stopped just outside, and he held his breath, waiting. A soft knock echoed through the room, followed by a low, hollow voice. "You shouldn't have come here, Thomas," it whispered, the sound sliding through the cracks in the door like a thin blade of ice. "This place is ours." He backed away, his flashlight shaking as he swept it around the room, searching for another exit. That was when he noticed something he hadn't seen before, a hidden door, half concealed behind a bookshelf. Desperate, he pushed the shelf aside, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Without a second thought, he ran down the stairs, his footsteps echoing off the stone walls as he plunged deeper into the bowels of the mansion. The air grew colder, and the darkness seemed to press in around him, thick and suffocating. At the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a long, narrow corridor lined with cell doors. The smell was overwhelming, decay, damp earth, and something metallic, like old blood. He shone his flashlight down the corridor, and his stomach twisted as he saw what lay inside the cells. Figures barely human, their eyes hollow and their mouths open in silent screams, chained to the walls as though left there to rot. Some of them looked as though they had been there for centuries, their flesh mummified and stretched tight over brittle bones. He staggered back, a wave of nausea washing over him, but before he could turn to run, he heard the footsteps again, this time coming from both ends of the corridor, closing in on him. Panic seized him as he turned to run, but he found himself facing a solid wall. The corridor had shifted, trapping him. As he pounded against the wall, desperate for an escape, the whispers grew louder, surrounding him, filling his mind with a cacophony of voices, all chanting the same thing: "Stay with us, stay forever." Suddenly, he felt an icy hand grip his shoulder, its fingers like iron as they dug into his flesh. He spun around, his flashlight slipping from his grasp as he came face to face with a figure cloaked in shadows, its eyes gleaming with a cold, predatory light. The figure leaned in, its mouth stretching into an unnatural smile, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. "We've been waiting for you, Thomas," it hissed, its voice a blend of countless others, each one filled with malice and hunger. "You're finally home." As he felt the figure's cold breath wash over him, the walls seemed to close in, and the last thing he saw was the twisted grin of the creature as it dragged him down into the darkness. Days later, a search party arrived at Ravenbrook Manor, but there was no sign of Thomas. Only his flashlight, lying abandoned in the entryway, its battery drained. They say that if you listen closely on a quiet night near the manor, you can still hear his voice among the whispers, begging for release, forever trapped within the shadows of Ravenbrook Manor. At the edge of an old, quiet town, hidden among ancient trees and choked by wild ivy, lay the ruins of an estate called Hollow's End. For decades, it had been abandoned, its windows shattered, its walls scarred by time and neglect. No one dared go near it, not since the whispers had begun, the rumors of a family's tragedy that had cursed the place for all who entered. The few who wandered close claimed to hear faint cries echoing through the night, and shadows shifting in the corners of their eyes. But to Jacob, a writer in desperate need of inspiration, Hollow's End was the perfect subject for his next book. He arrived in the dead of winter, his car packed with supplies, ready to spend a week in the old manor. The sun had barely set as he reached the estate, casting the land in a deep, creeping twilight. The air was thick, biting with a chill that seemed to seep into his bones. The closer he got, the more he felt a strange weight settle on him, as if invisible eyes were watching, waiting. He hesitated, but curiosity pulled him forward, his footsteps crunching over the snow as he approached the large, weathered doors. Pushing them open, he stepped into a grand foyer that had once been magnificent. Now it was cloaked in dust and shadows, the remnants of luxury lost to time. His breath fogged in the freezing air, and his footsteps echoed in the eerie silence. As he explored, he noticed peculiar details, portraits on the walls with faded eyes that seemed to follow him, cold drafts that came and went as if in rhythm with his movements. In one of the sitting rooms, he found a tarnished silver locket on a small, ornate table. Curiosity overtook him, and he opened it, revealing a photograph of a woman and a child, their faces solemn and strangely familiar, even though he was certain he'd never seen them before. He pocketed the locket, thinking it might add an interesting detail for his story. But the moment he did, he felt a chill unlike any other, as though a shadow had passed over his heart. That night, as he tried to sleep in one of the upstairs rooms, he found it impossible to ignore the faint noises echoing through the halls. Whispers just beyond his hearing, footsteps that stopped as soon as he strained to listen. He lay there in the dark, his mind racing with questions, yet every time he closed his eyes, he felt as though someone stood at the foot of his bed, watching him. When he finally managed to drift into a restless sleep, he dreamed of the woman and child from the locket. In the dream, they stood in the grand foyer, their faces twisted in fear as they tried to reach out to him, but he felt a cold, invisible barrier keeping him from moving toward them. The next morning, he woke to find frost coating the windows, the room frigid despite the fire he had tried to light. As he ventured downstairs, he found that the rooms had somehow shifted in the night. The once grand library, where he'd left his notebooks, was now a small, narrow corridor, its walls lined with mirrors. In each mirror, his reflection seemed slightly off. His eyes appeared darker, hollow, his face gaunt and worn. He backed away, unsettled, but as he turned, he heard a faint laugh echo down the corridor, high and childlike, laced with a mocking edge. Disturbed, he tried to leave the house for some fresh air, but when he reached the front door, he found it locked, the old brass key on the inside twisting on its own, as though manipulated by invisible hands. He pulled and shouted, but the door refused to budge. The windows were similarly resistant, as though the house itself had decided to hold him prisoner. Panic rose within him, but he forced himself to remain calm. He tried to return to the room he had slept in, but the staircase twisted as he climbed it, leading him to a hallway he hadn't seen before. As he wandered through the unfamiliar rooms, he saw glimpses of shadows flitting across the walls, and once, he thought he saw the child from his dream, standing at the end of a corridor, watching him with large, sorrowful eyes. He called out, but she disappeared, melting into the shadows. Every attempt to navigate back to familiar ground only brought him deeper into the maze of rooms and corridors that seemed to shift and stretch with each step he took. Days passed, though he lost track of time. Every night, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling his mind with fragments of a story he couldn't quite piece together. He began to see visions, images of the woman in the locket, wandering the halls in a tattered dress, her eyes filled with a haunting sorrow, her lips moving as though trying to speak, though no sound came. Once, he awoke in the middle of the night to find her standing by his bed, her hand reaching out to him, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes pleading. But when he tried to touch her, she vanished, leaving him with an intense, aching loneliness that felt like it would consume him. One night, as he sat in the library, poring over old journals he had found hidden behind a loose floorboard, he discovered the truth. The woman in the locket was named Eleanor Calloway, the last living member of the family who had once owned Hollow's End. She had a daughter, Lillian, who had fallen ill, and despite every effort to save her, the child had died in the dead of winter. Devastated, Eleanor had been consumed by grief, convinced that her daughter's spirit was still in the house. Her journals spoke of rituals, desperate attempts to call Lillian's soul back from the beyond, and of a growing darkness within the walls, a presence that seemed to feed on her despair. The final entry was chilling, written in jagged, desperate handwriting. The house has taken her, and now it wants me. There is no escape, it demands a soul. As he read those last words, the room grew unbearably cold, and he felt a presence behind him, breathing down his neck, its breath frigid as death. Slowly, he turned to find Eleanor herself standing there, her face twisted in agony, her hands reaching for him. Her mouth opened, and a hollow, echoing voice filled the room. "The house needs a soul, Jacob. Give it yours, and let me rest." He bolted from the library, stumbling through the darkened halls, his heart pounding as the house seemed to come alive around him. Doors slammed shut, trapping him, and shadows crawled along the walls, reaching out to him with grasping, skeletal fingers. The whispers were deafening now, voices pleading, weeping, demanding his soul. He felt his strength fading, as though the very air he breathed was poisoned, sapping his life away with each step. Desperate, he tried to reach the front door, but the hallways twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the heart of the house. Finally, he collapsed in a small, dark room he didn't recognize. The walls were lined with old family portraits, their faces watching him with expressions of pity and sorrow. In the center of the room stood a single, dusty chair. Exhausted, defeated, he slumped into the chair, feeling the cold seep into his bones, and as he sat there, he felt his life draining away, leaving him hollow, empty. The last thing he saw was Eleanor's face, her eyes filled with a strange, sorrowful gratitude, as her spirit faded into the shadows, finally released. When the townsfolk found the house weeks later, they found Jacob's belongings, but there was no sign of him, only a thin layer of frost covering everything, as if the house itself had been frozen in time. Some say if you listen closely near Hollow's End, you can still hear his voice among the whispers, calling out for release, forever bound to the house that had claimed his soul. There was a small, forgotten village at the edge of the woods, where the houses were worn and crooked, as if the village itself were slowly sinking into the earth. The villagers spoke in hushed tones about the strange happenings in the nearby forest, whispers of figures seen moving between the trees, faces that appeared in the reflection of ponds, and the faint sounds of crying carried by the wind. Among the village's many dark stories, the most chilling was the tale of the Black Hollow, an abandoned church deep within the woods that no one had dared approach for centuries. Lena had always been drawn to the eerie, the unexplained, the places others feared to tread. She'd grown up hearing the terrifying stories about Black Hollow, about how those who entered never came back. Curiosity ate away at her until one cold autumn morning, she decided she would venture into the woods and see the cursed church for herself. The villagers warned her, pleading for her to stay away, but their fear only deepened her resolve. She packed a bag with food, a flashlight, and a map, then set off into the dense forest, determined to uncover whatever truth lay behind the terrifying legend. The forest was silent as Lena made her way deeper, the trees growing thicker around her, their twisted branches like bony hands reaching for the sky. The air grew damp and heavy, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. Every step she took seemed to be swallowed by the soft, moss-covered ground, and she soon lost track of time as the forest seemed to stretch endlessly before her. The path had grown faint, the markers barely visible, but she pressed on, ignoring the creeping sensation that she was being watched. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, she finally saw it. The church, standing in the clearing like a rotting monument to some forgotten age. The building was tall, its roof caved in, and the stone walls crumbled with age. Black vines crawled up the sides, and the windows were shattered, their jagged edges glinting like broken teeth. The door was ajar, the dark interior beckoning her forward. Lena stood at the threshold for a moment, her heart racing, but the allure of the mystery was too strong. She stepped inside. The church was cold, the air thick with the scent of decay and dust. The altar at the front was covered in grime, and scattered across the floor were remnants of candles, their wax long melted away. The silence inside was suffocating, almost as if the building itself was holding a secret, something ancient and malevolent. As Lena moved further into the church, she noticed strange markings carved into the stone, symbols she didn't recognize, but their meaning was unmistakable. They seemed to pulse faintly, like a heartbeat just beneath the surface. Suddenly she heard it, a soft, whispering sound, like a chant in an unknown language, barely audible but growing louder. She froze, listening intently. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the altar. Her pulse quickened as she approached, her flashlight flickering in the oppressive dark. The closer she got, the louder the whispers became, until they filled her mind, a chorus of voices, desperate and pleading. The words were unintelligible, but the feeling they evoked was unmistakable, a sense of dread so deep it made her stomach churn. When she reached the altar, she found something she hadn't expected, an old, weathered book lying open on the stone surface. The pages were yellowed with age, and the ink was faint, but there was something familiar about the symbols inscribed within it. As she flipped through the pages, one word stood out among the rest: sacrifice. Lena's breath caught in her throat as the whispers seemed to crescendo, their voices growing frantic. She turned the page, revealing a diagram of the church's floor plan, with markings indicating certain locations. Beneath the diagram was a passage, written in an archaic script that made her skin crawl. As she read it aloud, the room seemed to tremble, and the ground beneath her feet began to shake. Suddenly, the church doors slammed shut with a deafening crash. Lena spun around, her flashlight darting across the room, but there was nothing except the shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally, curling and twisting as though alive. The whispers intensified, now forming coherent phrases, chanting her name in a voice that sounded like 1,000 voices layered over each other, desperate and pleading. She tried to reach the door, but it was as if an invisible force was holding it shut. She pounded on the wood, but her hands passed right through it, like it was made of smoke. Panicking, she turned back to the altar, but the room had changed. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows gathering in the corners, and in the distance, a low growl rumbled, as if something were waking from a long slumber. That's when she saw it, figures emerging from the dark corners of the church. At first, they were barely more than shadows, but as they drew closer, their shapes solidified. Pale, gaunt faces, their eyes wide with fear, their mouths stretched into unnatural grins. The figures were the souls of those who had entered the church before her, each one forever trapped, their eyes hollow with madness. They reached out for her, their bony hands grasping for her flesh, but just as they were about to touch her, they stopped. A figure emerged from the shadows behind them, a tall, cloaked figure whose face was hidden beneath a hood. It moved with an unsettling fluidity, its every step reverberating in the air. The whispers fell silent, and the figure spoke, its voice low and guttural. "You should not have come here," it said, its words seeping into Lena's mind like a poison. "The church demands its due, and now you are the offering." Lena tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She struggled against an invisible force, her body paralyzed by an overwhelming sense of fear. The figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating, and she felt an icy hand brush against her cheek. The world around her spun, the shadows closing in tighter, until the only thing she could see was the figure's face, pale and twisted, with eyes that burned with an ancient hunger. Before she could scream, everything went black. Days later, the villagers found the church, still standing in the woods, untouched by time. But there was no sign of Lena. The only trace of her presence was a small, tattered book lying on the altar, its pages fluttering in the wind. Some say she became one of the shadows, trapped within the church, her soul forever bound to its dark history. Others say she became the church's latest offering, her name added to the whispers that now call to anyone who dares to enter Black Hollow. And when the wind blows through the trees, the villagers say they can hear her voice, faint and pleading, calling out from the darkness of the woods, begging to be released. But no one has ever answered her call. In the vast expanse of the Northlands, where winter seemed endless and the nights stretched on forever, there existed a kingdom called Asfer. Surrounded by towering snow-covered mountains and dense, frost-bitten forests, Asfer was a kingdom ruled by King Nalan, a ruler known for his wisdom and strength. His people adored him, for he had protected them through many hardships, famine, drought, and even war. But Nalan had one weakness that only his closest advisors knew of, a prophecy that haunted him since his youth. A prophecy foretelling the arrival of a great darkness that would one day threaten his kingdom, a darkness that no sword nor shield could defeat. This prophecy, given to him by an old seer, had plagued his dreams and cast a shadow over his rule. For the seer had warned that the only way to defeat this darkness was to find the heart of winter, a mythical relic believed to be hidden somewhere in the depths of the frozen wilds, far beyond the borders of his kingdom, where no one had ever dared to venture. As years passed, King Nalan grew older, and his son, Prince Edrin, grew into a young man of courage and loyalty. Edrin had heard rumors of the prophecy, but had never known its full extent. It wasn't until his father fell gravely ill, his strength waning with each passing day, that he summoned Edrin to his chamber and revealed the truth. Nalan spoke of the prophecy, of the dark power that was destined to rise, and of the heart of winter, which was said to hold the power to banish this darkness. But he also spoke of the dangers of the frozen wilds, a land so cold that even the bravest warriors had perished within hours of entering. Thalan's voice was weak, but his eyes held a fierce determination as he told his son that it was now his duty to protect Asfer, to fulfill the prophecy and find the heart of winter before it was too late. Without hesitation, Edrin accepted the task, swearing to his father that he would return with the relic and secure the safety of their people. Edrin prepared for his journey, gathering supplies, consulting with scholars, and training for the harsh conditions of the frozen wilds. He was joined by 3 of his most loyal companions: Rowan, a skilled tracker and archer; Kira, a healer with knowledge of the ancient herbs and plants; and Torvald, a towering warrior known for his strength and loyalty. Together, they set out from the kingdom, traveling through the dense forests and across frozen rivers, each day bringing them closer to the edge of the known world. The journey was grueling, the cold biting into their bones, and they encountered many challenges along the way. Treacherous ice fields that threatened to swallow them whole, snowstorms that left them blind and disoriented, and strange creatures that lurked in the shadows, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. Yet, despite the hardships, Edrin and his companions pressed on, driven by the knowledge that their kingdom's survival depended on their success. Days turned into weeks, and soon they reached the edge of the frozen wilds, a desolate wasteland where the wind howled like a beast and the ground was covered in ice as far as the eye could see. The air was so cold that their breath froze in midair, and they were forced to cover their faces with thick furs to protect themselves from frostbite. It was here, in this unforgiving land, that they encountered the first of many trials. They came upon a massive ice wall, so tall that it seemed to touch the sky. There was no way around it, and climbing it seemed impossible. But as they searched for a solution, Rowan noticed strange markings etched into the ice, symbols that glowed faintly in the moonlight. Kira, who had studied the ancient texts, recognized the symbols as a riddle, a test to determine if they were worthy of passing through. They spent hours deciphering the riddle, each line revealing a clue to the solution. When they finally spoke the answer aloud, the ice wall began to crack, a narrow passageway opening before them. They continued onward, venturing deeper into the frozen wilds, where the land grew colder and the air thinner. The second trial came when they reached a valley filled with towering ice sculptures, each one depicting a different creature: wolves, bears, even mythical beasts like dragons and griffins. As they moved through the valley, the sculptures began to stir, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Edrin and his companions realized too late that these sculptures were guardians, enchanted creatures bound to protect the heart of winter from intruders. They fought with all their strength, dodging the icy claws and fangs of the creatures, their weapons barely scratching the enchanted ice. Kira, remembering an ancient chant taught to her by her grandmother, began to sing a melody that echoed through the valley. The creatures paused, their movements slowing, and Edrin seized the opportunity to lead his friends out of the valley, the haunting melody fading as they escaped. Exhausted and wounded, they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that they were close, that the heart of winter was near. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the final trial. a massive chasm filled with swirling, icy mist. On the other side, they could see a faint glow, a light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Edrin knew that this was the heart of winter, but the chasm seemed impassable, a void that stretched endlessly in both directions. Desperate, Edrin knelt on the edge, calling out to the spirits of the frozen wilds, pleading for their help. For a long moment, there was only silence, and then, a voice echoed in his mind, ancient and powerful. It spoke of sacrifice, of the price that must be paid to claim the heart of winter. Edrin understood at once. He turned to his companions, gratitude in his eyes, and told them that he must cross the chasm alone. Despite their protests, he stepped forward, feeling the icy mist swirl around him, lifting him into the air. As he floated across the chasm, he felt his strength fading, his vision blurring, but he kept his gaze fixed on the glowing light, his hand outstretched. At last, he reached the heart of winter, a crystal of pure ice, radiating a cold so intense that it burned his skin. Summoning the last of his strength, he grasped the crystal, feeling its power surge through him, filling him with a warmth that was both fierce and gentle. With the heart of winter in his hands, he felt a connection to the land, to the spirits of the frozen wilds, and he knew that the darkness threatening his kingdom would be banished. When he returned to his companions, they could see the change in him, a light in his eyes that had not been there before. They journeyed back to Asfer, the heart of winter safely in Edrin's possession. When they finally returned to the kingdom, they were met with cheers and tears, for word had spread of their journey, of the trials they had faced. Edrin went to his father, holding the heart of winter before him, and as the crystal's light filled the room, King Thalin's strength returned, his illness lifting like a fog. The kingdom rejoiced, for the prophecy had been fulfilled, the darkness banished, and Asfer was safe once more. Edrin became a legend, a hero whose tale would be told for generations, but he knew that it was not just his strength that had saved them, but the loyalty of his friends, the wisdom of his ancestors, and the spirit of the land itself. And so, he ruled with humility and gratitude, always remembering the journey that had brought him to this moment. It was a test of patience, of understanding, and of unity, for they knew that only by working together could they find the solution. When they spoke the answer aloud, the glyphs glowed, and a doorway appeared, leading them to the final trial. The third and final trial was one of the heart. They found themselves in a vast, silent field under a starlit sky, facing visions of their deepest fears, their darkest regrets. Alaric saw his family, lost to the ravages of time, saw himself alone and adrift, his heart weighed down by sorrow. Each of his companions faced their own specters, memories of loss, of failures, of loved ones left behind. It was a test of inner strength, of confronting the past and finding peace. With tears in his eyes, Alaric stepped forward, speaking words of comfort to his friends, reminding them that they were not defined by their pasts, but by the courage they held in their hearts. His words gave them strength, and together, they banished the visions, emerging from the trial with newfound clarity and unity. At last, they reached the heart of the Vale, where the stars hard rested, a crystal of ethereal beauty that pulsed with a gentle, warm light. Alaric approached it, feeling its power resonate within him, a force that seemed to speak to his very soul. As he reached out to touch it, he felt a surge of energy, a connection to the past, the present, and the future of Talendra. The stars hard revealed to him a vision of the kingdom, of the peace and prosperity that could be achieved if it were used wisely, but also of the destruction that could come if its power were wielded recklessly. With a heart full of hope, Alaric made his decision. He swore to use the stars hard to protect his people, to uphold the ideals of House Morvain, to bring an era of peace to Talendra. With his companions by his side, he returned to Elder's Reach, where he presented the stars hard to the king. King Galdrin, with tears in his eyes, saw in Alaric the heir he had longed for, the soul worthy of carrying forth his legacy. He named Alaric as his successor, adopting him as his son, and sealing a new bond that would forever unite the kingdom. And so, Alaric became the first king of a new era, a ruler whose story would echo through the ages as the one who braved the veil of the Eternals, who faced the trials of strength, wisdom, and heart, and who held the power to reshape fate with the purity of his spirit. Under his reign, Talendra flourished, becoming a beacon of hope and unity, its people thriving under the guidance of a ruler who had faced the depths of his soul and emerged stronger for it. And though the veil of the Eternals would fade back into legend, its legacy lived on in Alaric, the humble fisherman who had risen to become a king. The trials he had faced, and the heart of winter that had given him the strength to protect his people. In the deep, hidden forests of Elderglen, where ancient trees towered so high that their branches seemed to brush the sky and sunlight was filtered through a canopy of thick green leaves, lay a village called Hallowmere. Hallowmere was a quiet place, untouched by the chaos of the world, where people lived in harmony with the land, tending their farms, raising their families, and telling tales around the fire at night. Yet, despite the peace that enveloped this village, there was one tale that stirred fear in the hearts of even the bravest villagers. It was the tale of the Shrouded Grove, a cursed part of the forest that lay beyond the boundaries of Hallowmere, veiled in a perpetual mist and filled with an unnatural silence. The Shrouded Grove was said to be haunted, home to spirits that roamed the misty woods at night, looking for lost souls to lead astray. No one who entered the grove ever returned, and even the elders of Hallowmere, who had lived through countless seasons, avoided it at all costs. Yet, as with all legends, there were those who doubted its truth, especially the young and curious minds of the village. One such skeptic was a young woman named Lyra. She had grown up hearing the stories of the Shrouded Grove from her grandmother, who would warn her to stay far away from it. But Lyra was restless, filled with a thirst for adventure and a fascination with the unknown. While the others in her village lived contentedly, tending to their daily tasks, Lyra dreamed of exploring the world beyond the village, of discovering hidden secrets and unraveling ancient mysteries. And so, on a misty autumn morning, just as the first leaves began to turn golden, Lyra set out toward the Shrouded Grove, ignoring the warnings of her friends and family. She carried only a small satchel filled with provisions, a knife for protection, and a talisman her grandmother had given her, said to ward off evil spirits. As she approached the edge of the grove, the air grew colder, and the familiar sounds of the forest, birdsong, rustling leaves, the distant call of a deer, faded into silence. Lyra felt a chill run down her spine, but her curiosity propelled her forward. She stepped into the mist, the world around her becoming a blur of gray shadows and twisted tree trunks. The deeper she ventured, the thicker the mist grew, until she could barely see her own hand in front of her face. The silence was oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. It was hard to tell in the grove, where time seemed to lose its meaning. Lyra felt a strange sensation, as if she were being watched, but when she turned, there was nothing there, only the endless mist. She called out, hoping to break the silence, but her voice was swallowed by the fog, leaving only an echo that seemed to linger, hauntingly, in the air. Just as she was beginning to doubt her decision, she saw a faint light flickering in the distance. Her heart quickened, and she moved toward it, stumbling over roots and rocks hidden by the mist. The light grew brighter, and she realized it was coming from a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient tree, its trunk gnarled and twisted, its branches bare and reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. At the base of the tree, a figure was crouched, a man shrouded in a tattered cloak, his face hidden beneath a hood. He was holding a lantern, the source of the light, which cast an eerie glow over the clearing. Lyra hesitated, but her curiosity overcame her fear, and she stepped forward, calling out to the stranger. The figure turned slowly, and as he lifted his head, Lyra felt a shiver of recognition. His face was pale and hollow, his eyes a piercing shade of blue that seemed to see through her. He was neither young nor old, his features ageless and unsettling. He introduced himself as Fenris, a guardian of the Shrouded Grove, bound to the forest by a curse that he could not escape. Fenris told her that long ago he had been a healer, a man devoted to protecting the forest and its creatures. But he had angered a powerful spirit by trying to save a young child who had been lost in the grove. The spirit, angered by his interference, had cursed him to remain in the grove for eternity, never to leave, never to know peace. His only companion was the lantern, which held a fragment of his soul, bound to him by magic older than the trees themselves. Fenris warned Lyra that she should leave, that the grove was a place of lost souls, of restless spirits that would not take kindly to her presence. But Lyra, fascinated by his story, refused to leave. She asked him to show her the secrets of the grove, to reveal the mysteries that had been hidden from the world for centuries. Fenris, though reluctant, saw something in Lyra's eyes, a determination, a courage that reminded him of the life he had once lived. He agreed on the condition that she would leave at dawn, for if she stayed longer, the grove would claim her as it had claimed so many before. And so, under the pale light of the lantern, Fenris led Lyra deeper into the Shrouded Grove, guiding her through the misty paths and ancient trees. He showed her hidden glades filled with rare herbs, plants that glowed with an ethereal light, and pools of water so clear they mirrored the stars. He told her stories of the spirits that dwelled in the forest, of the creatures that roamed the night, and of the magic that bound the grove to the world of the living. As they wandered, Lyra felt a strange sense of belonging, as if the grove were calling to her, whispering secrets only she could hear. Hours passed, and dawn began to break, casting a faint light over the forest. Fenris urged her to leave, to return to her village and forget the grove, but Lyra hesitated, drawn to the forest in a way she could not explain. She begged Fenris to let her stay, to teach her more about the magic of the grove, about the spirits that dwelled within it. But Fenris, his eyes filled with sorrow, shook his head. He told her that the grove was a place of the lost, a realm that demanded a sacrifice from all who entered. If she stayed, she would be bound to the grove, just as he was, forever a part of its endless cycle of mist and shadow. Reluctantly, Lyra turned to leave, but as she walked away, she felt a deep ache in her heart, a longing that pulled her back toward the grove. She turned one last time to look at Fenris, but he was already fading into the mist, his lantern flickering like a distant star. As she left the shrouded grove and returned to her village, Lyra felt changed. The world around her seemed dull, lifeless, as if the colors had faded, the sounds muted. She tried to return to her old life, to forget the grove and the strange encounter with Fenris, but the memories haunted her, filling her dreams with visions of mist and shadows, of ancient trees and silent spirits. Over time, Lyra grew distant from her family and friends, spending her days wandering the edges of the forest, hoping to catch a glimpse of the grove, to hear the whispers of the spirits once more. She became a legend in her own right, known as the Witch of Hallowmere, a woman touched by the forest, filled with knowledge of herbs and healing, of spirits and shadows. She would sit by the fire at night, telling stories to the children of the village, warning them of the dangers of the shrouded grove, of the spirits that dwelled within. But in her heart, she knew that one day she would return, that the grove would call her back, and that she would walk once more through the misty paths, guided by the light of the lantern and the ageless gaze of Fenris. And so, as the years passed, Lyra grew older, her hair turning silver, her eyes still filled with the same curiosity and longing that had led her to the grove so many years before. On a quiet autumn night, with the first frost settling over the fields, she slipped away from the village, leaving behind only a small talisman by her bedside, a gift from her grandmother, a protection against evil. The villagers searched for her, but Lyra was never seen again. Some say she was taken by the spirits of the grove, claimed as a lost soul. Others say she found Fenris and joined him as a guardian of the forest, a spirit bound to the mist and shadows. But in the village of Hallowmere, her story lived on, told around the fire on misty autumn nights, a tale of curiosity and courage, of sacrifice and mystery, of a young woman who dared to venture into the shrouded grove, and of the secrets she discovered within its depths. In the ancient land of Talendra, a realm woven with magic and mystery, there was a forgotten valley known as Vale of the Eternals. This place, hidden from all maps and only spoken of in whispers, was said to be a sanctuary for powers beyond mortal understanding, a refuge where spirits, lost souls, and ancient beings rested. Legends told of an artifact hidden there, a crystal known as the Star's Heart, which held the power to alter fate itself. It was rumored that anyone who found and claimed the Star's Heart could reshape the very fabric of destiny, either bringing forth a golden age or unleashing unimaginable chaos. The kingdom of Talendra had, for centuries, flourished under the rule of House Morvain, a dynasty known for its wisdom, valor, and fairness. But King Galdrin, the last of the Morvain bloodline, was aging and without an heir. His court was fraught with tension, nobles and advisors each vying for influence and control, knowing that the stability of the realm would soon be in jeopardy. King Galdrin, who had once been a mighty warrior, was haunted by visions of his kingdom in ruins, of fires consuming the grand citadel of Elder's Reach, of shadows overtaking the lands. These visions troubled him deeply, as they grew more vivid and ominous with each passing night. Desperate, he sought counsel from the royal oracle, a seer known as Celeste, who possessed insight beyond the grasp of ordinary mortals. Celeste told him of the Star's Heart in the Vale of the Eternals, revealing that it was perhaps the only force powerful enough to reshape the fate of Talendra and stave off the darkness he had seen. However, she warned him that finding it would require a soul both pure and resilient, for the Vale was guarded by ancient wards, challenges that would test not only strength, but the very heart and spirit of anyone who entered. Yet King Galdrin had no family left, no one he could send, and the burden of the quest weighed heavily on him, for he knew that without a worthy heir or a miraculous salvation, Talendra would fall. At this time, far from the royal court, there was a young man named Alaric, who lived in a quiet village by the sea, unaware of the turmoil that plagued the kingdom. He was a humble fisherman, known for his kind heart and boundless curiosity about the world beyond the waves. Orphaned as a child, he had been raised by his aunt and uncle, who had often recounted tales of the grandeur of Talendra and the mighty House Morvain, though such stories seemed like myths to Alaric, as he lived a simple life focused on daily survival. One evening, as Alaric walked along the shore, he saw an unusual sight, a falcon, bearing the crest of House Morvain, circling above him before descending and landing on a rock nearby. Attached to its leg was a scroll sealed with the royal insignia. Alaric's hands shook as he broke the seal and read the letter, which spoke of an ancient artifact, a quest, and a summons to the royal court. In disbelief, he looked around, wondering if this was some elaborate jest. Yet he could feel the weight of the words, the urgency of the call, and in his heart, he felt a strange pull, a sense that this was meant for him. Against the advice of his family, who warned him of the dangers, Alaric journeyed to Elder's Reach, the capital of Talendra. It was a grand city with towering walls and streets bustling with life, unlike anything he had ever seen. He was ushered into the royal palace, where he stood before the aged King Galdrin, who looked upon him with eyes filled with both hope and sorrow. The king explained the dire circumstances, the visions that haunted him, and the prophecy surrounding the stars hard. He spoke of the veil of the Eternals, the trials that awaited, and the promise of salvation if the stars hard could be retrieved and used wisely. Alaric, though overwhelmed, felt a fire ignite within him, a courage he had not known he possessed. Swearing fealty to the king, he pledged to embark on the quest, to seek out the stars hard and bring hope back to Talendra. The king provided him with a small escort, a group of 4 skilled companions to aid him on his journey. There was Melis, a fierce warrior with unmatched skill in swordsmanship, Nara, a cunning rogue and master of stealth, Leora, a healer with knowledge of ancient remedies, and Brecken, a scholar and mage who had studied the arcane secrets of the land. Together, they set out, leaving behind the familiar lands of Talendra as they ventured into the wilds, toward the fabled Vale of the Eternals. They traveled through dense forests, across perilous mountains, and through harsh deserts, each new landscape more treacherous than the last. As they drew closer to the Vale, they encountered signs of the ancient magic that protected it. Strange creatures with otherworldly auras, illusions that distorted their path, and storms that seemed to spring from nowhere, blocking their way. But with each challenge, Alaric found strength he did not know he had. He led his companions with a quiet determination, a resilience that inspired them, for they could see in his eyes a depth of resolve that reminded them of the legends of old. Finally, they reached the edge of the Vale of the Eternals, a place that seemed to exist outside of time. The air was thick with magic, shimmering like mist in the early dawn. They knew that beyond this point lay the trials that would test them in ways they could scarcely imagine. The first trial was one of strength and endurance. They found themselves in a labyrinth of stone, with walls that shifted and closed in, leaving them trapped in a maze that seemed to stretch on forever. Shadows moved within the maze, dark creatures that attacked from the darkness, testing their skill and resilience. Alaric fought side by side with his companions, his strength surprising even himself as he defended his friends, carving a path through the endless corridors. After what felt like days, they emerged from the labyrinth, battered but triumphant, each of them realizing that they were stronger together than alone. The second trial was one of wisdom. They entered a chamber filled with ancient glyphs, the walls lined with texts written in a language long forgotten. Brecken, the scholar, recognized some of the symbols, realizing that they needed to solve a riddle hidden within the texts. Hours passed as they pieced together the clues, each symbol revealing a fragment of the answer. It was a test of patience, of understanding, and of unity, for they knew that only by working together could they find the solution. When they spoke the answer aloud, the glyphs glowed, and a doorway appeared, leading them to the final trial. The third and final trial was one of the heart. They found themselves in a vast, silent field under a starlit sky, facing visions of their deepest fears, their darkest regrets. Alaric saw his family, lost to the ravages of time, saw himself alone and adrift, his heart weighed down by sorrow. Each of his companions faced their own specters, memories of loss, of failures, of loved ones left behind. It was a test of inner strength, of confronting the past and finding peace. With tears in his eyes, Alaric stepped forward, speaking words of comfort to his friends, reminding them that they were not defined by their pasts but by the courage they held in their hearts. His words gave them strength, and together they banished the visions, emerging from the trial with newfound clarity and unity. At last they reached the heart of the vale, where the stars hard rested, a crystal of ethereal beauty that pulsed with a gentle, warm light. Alaric approached it, feeling its power resonate within him, a force that seemed to speak to his very soul. As he reached out to touch it, he felt a surge of energy, a connection to the past, the present, and the future of Talendra. The stars hard revealed to him a vision of the kingdom, of the peace and prosperity that could be achieved if it were used wisely, but also of the destruction that could come if its power were wielded recklessly. With a heart full of hope, Alaric made his decision. He swore to use the stars hard to protect his people, to uphold the ideals of House Morvain, to bring an era of peace to Talendra. With his companions by his side, he returned to Elder's Reach, where he presented the stars hard to the king. King Galdrin, with tears in his eyes, saw in Alaric the heir he had longed for, the soul worthy of carrying forth his legacy. He named Alaric as his successor, adopting him as his son and sealing a new bond that would forever unite the kingdom. And so, Alaric became the first king of a new era, a ruler whose story would echo through the ages as the one who braved the veil of the Eternals, who faced the trials of strength, wisdom, and heart, and who held the power to reshape fate with the purity of his spirit. Under his reign, Talendra flourished, becoming a beacon of hope and unity, its people thriving under the guidance of a ruler who had faced the depths of his soul and emerged stronger for it. And though the veil of the Eternals would fade back into legend, its legacy lived on in Alaric, the humble fisherman who had risen to become a king. And in Rivenmore, the people told stories of the woman who had ventured into the veiled abyss, who had become the new guardian of the lake, a spirit bound to the mist and shadows, watching over the ancient magic that lay hidden beneath the water. And as the years passed, the legend grew, a tale of courage, sacrifice, and the mystery of the veiled abyss, where the heart of the abyss still pulsed with a gentle light, a beacon for those who dared to seek it, a reminder of the woman who had given her life to protect it. In the distant kingdom of Andril, where towering mountains met lush valleys and rivers carved through emerald forests, there was a town called Rivenmore, nestled near a deep and mysterious lake known as the Veiled Abyss. The lake earned its name because of the dense, perpetual mist that hung over its surface, making it nearly impossible to see beyond a few feet. The people of Rivenmore believed the Veiled Abyss was cursed, a portal to a darker world, where spirits and creatures from ancient tales lurked in the shadows. Parents warned their children to stay away from the lake, and fishermen who braved its waters told stories of strange lights beneath the surface, eerie whispers, and shadows that moved as though alive. Among the townsfolk was a young woman named Alara, who had lived her whole life in Rivenmore. She was quiet and thoughtful, her eyes always seeming to focus on something beyond the present, something hidden and distant. Alara had always felt a strange pull toward the Veiled Abyss, an inexplicable curiosity that had only grown stronger with each passing year. She would often sit on the shore, watching the mist shift and swirl, listening to the faint sounds that drifted from the depths of the lake, sounds that seemed like the echoes of voices calling her name. Her grandmother, an old healer who still remembered the ancient ways, had often told Alara stories of the lake, warning her of the dangers and speaking of a powerful relic hidden within the depths, a crystal known as the Heart of the Abyss. According to legend, the Heart of the Abyss was a source of immense power, created by the first mages of Andril to protect the kingdom from dark forces. But over time, the magic had turned, corrupting the lake and trapping the crystal beneath the water, where it now lay guarded by the spirits of those who had tried and failed to claim it. Her grandmother had warned her that the crystal was a lure, a trap set to ensnare those who sought power. But Alara could not shake the feeling that the heart was calling to her, drawing her to the Veiled Abyss. One night, unable to resist any longer, she crept from her home and made her way to the lake, the mist thick and heavy around her, muffling the sounds of the town behind her. She waded into the water, the chill biting into her skin, and with each step, she felt a strange warmth in her chest, a pulsing rhythm that seemed to guide her, as though the crystal itself were leading her to its hiding place. Deeper and deeper she went, until the water was up to her waist, her heart pounding as the mist closed in around her, hiding the shore from view. Suddenly, she felt a presence, a cold, dark energy that filled the air, making it difficult to breathe. She stopped, frozen in place, as a figure appeared before her, rising from the water as though formed from the mist itself. It was a man, tall and cloaked in shadows, his face obscured, his eyes gleaming with a cold, piercing light. He introduced himself as Kalen, a guardian of the heart of the abyss, bound to protect it from those who sought to use its power for their own gain. He told her that the heart was not a gift, but a curse, a relic that had absorbed the darkest magic in the kingdom, a power that would consume anyone who dared to claim it. But Alara, driven by a need she could not explain, refused to turn back. She insisted that she was not seeking power but understanding, a chance to unravel the mysteries that had haunted her for so long. Kalen, though skeptical, saw something in her eyes, a determination, a purity that was rare in those who came to the veiled abyss. He warned her that to reach the heart, she would have to face trials, challenges that would test her spirit, her mind, and her heart, and that if she failed, she would be bound to the lake, just as he was, her soul forever trapped in the mist. Alara agreed, knowing that she could not return without the answers she sought, and Kalen led her into the depths of the lake, where the water grew dark and cold, where the light of the stars above faded into an endless void. They journeyed through the shadows, past ancient ruins submerged in the lake, past statues of forgotten gods and temples that had been lost to time. The first trial was one of courage. Alara found herself in a chamber filled with swirling shadows, where figures from her past appeared. Her fears, her regrets, the moments she had tried to bury. She saw herself as a child, alone and afraid, as a young woman, uncertain of her path, and as she faced each vision, she felt a weight lift from her heart, as though the lake were drawing out her pain, leaving her lighter, freer. When she emerged from the chamber, Kalen was waiting, his eyes unreadable, but she could sense a change in him, a softening, as though he too were affected by her journey. The second trial was one of wisdom. She found herself in a cavern filled with strange symbols, ancient runes that glowed faintly in the darkness. She was given a riddle, a question that seemed to speak to the very essence of the universe, a puzzle that twisted her mind, forcing her to think beyond the boundaries of human understanding. Hours passed, and as she struggled with the answer, she felt the weight of the lake pressing down on her, as though it were testing her resolve, her patience. Finally, the answer came to her, a revelation that filled her with a sense of clarity, a knowledge that went beyond words, a connection to the ancient magic that had created the heart. The third and final trial was one of the heart. She found herself in a vast, empty space where only silence remained, a silence that seemed to echo with the sorrow of lost souls, the regrets of those who had come before her. She saw visions of her family, her friends, the people she loved, and she was given a choice: to leave the lake, to return to her life, to forget the heart and the power it held, or to stay, to claim the heart, and to take on the burden of its magic, knowing that she would never return. For a moment she hesitated, torn between her desire to understand and her love for those she would leave behind. But as she looked into the depths of the lake, she felt a strange peace, a sense that this was her destiny, that she had been chosen not to wield the heart, but to guard it, to protect it from those who would misuse its power. She chose to stay, and as she made her decision, the darkness lifted, and she found herself standing before the heart of the abyss, a crystal that pulsed with a soft, gentle light, a light that seemed to contain the essence of the lake itself, the dreams and sorrows of those who had come before. Kalen appeared beside her, his face no longer shrouded in shadows, his eyes filled with gratitude and sorrow. He told her that by choosing to guard the heart, she had broken the curse that bound him, that he was finally free to leave the lake, to find peace. But he warned her that the heart was a heavy burden, that it would test her strength and her spirit, and that she would be bound to the lake until another came to take her place. Alara accepted her fate, feeling a strange joy and sorrow, knowing that she had found the answers she sought, that she had become a part of the legend she had once dismissed as a tale. As Kalen faded into the mist, Alara took her place by the heart of the abyss, her spirit bound to the lake, a guardian of its secrets, a protector of its power. In a realm beyond the borders of ordinary understanding, hidden between vast forests and cliffs, lay a town called Shadowmere. This town was isolated, surrounded by dense fog and twisting, overgrown paths that kept it hidden from the world. Shadowmere was a place of age-old traditions, whispers of magic, and superstitions passed down through countless generations. The townsfolk lived simple lives, but they harbored a great fear of the Wailing Wood, a forest that began just outside the town. The forest was always shrouded in an unnatural mist, a fog that clung to the trees and muffled any sound within its bounds. No birds sang, no animals dared to venture near it, and those who entered never returned. Legend had it that the forest was cursed, inhabited by spirits who were unable to rest, trapped within the shadows of the trees. No one knew where the curse had come from, or why the spirits were bound to the forest, but the people of Shadowmere knew well enough to keep their distance. However, curiosity knows no bounds, and as the stories of the Wailing Wood persisted, a young woman named Marin found herself drawn to the forest in ways she could not explain. Marin had always been different from the others in Shadowmere. While her friends would rush home before dusk, wary of the whispers that came from the forest, Marin would linger, watching the mist gather around the trees, her heart filled with a yearning she did not understand. Her grandmother, the town's healer and wise woman, had often warned her of the dangers of the Wailing Wood, telling her tales of the spirits who roamed the mist, searching for lost souls. But Marin felt an inexplicable pull toward the forest, a feeling that grew stronger with each passing year. On the night of the new moon, when the mist was thickest and the forest seemed to come alive with shadows, Marin felt the pull more powerfully than ever before. Unable to resist, she left her home and made her way to the edge of the Wailing Wood, the silence pressing down on her like a weight. She hesitated for a moment, hearing the faint echoes of her grandmother's warnings in her mind, but something deep within her urged her to continue. She stepped into the mist, the world around her fading as she moved deeper into the forest. The trees loomed above her, their twisted branches forming strange shapes in the fog, and the silence was so intense that even her footsteps seemed muted. As she ventured deeper, Marin felt a strange sensation, a tingling in her chest, as though something within the forest was calling to her. She could feel the presence of the spirits, the weight of their sorrow pressing down on her, filling the air with a cold, bitter energy. She continued onward, her heart pounding, until she came to a clearing where the mist seemed to thin, revealing a strange sight. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, its bark dark and gnarled, its branches twisted and bare. At the base of the tree, she saw a figure, a woman dressed in tattered robes, her face hidden beneath a hood. The woman's skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes glowed with an eerie light. Marin felt a shiver run down her spine as she approached, but she could not turn away. The woman looked up, her gaze piercing, and she introduced herself as Naira, a spirit bound to the Wailing Wood, a guardian of its secrets. Naira explained that the forest had once been a place of beauty, a sanctuary for those who sought refuge, but it had been cursed long ago, a curse that trapped the souls of those who had died within its bounds, binding them to the forest for eternity. Naira herself had once been a healer, a protector of the forest, but she had angered a powerful sorcerer by refusing to aid him in his quest for dark magic. In his rage, he had cast a spell that bound her and all who entered the forest to the shadows, their souls forever trapped, unable to find peace. Naira told Marin that the only way to break the curse was to retrieve a relic hidden deep within the forest, a relic known as the Tear of Eternity. The tear was said to be a crystal formed from the sorrows of the spirits, a powerful object that held the key to breaking the curse. But the path to the tear was treacherous, filled with trials that would test Marin's courage, her wisdom, and her compassion. Marin, though afraid, felt a surge of determination. She had always felt different, as though her life in Shadowmere was only a small part of her destiny, and now she understood why. She agreed to help Naira, to retrieve the tear and free the spirits trapped within the Wailing Wood. Naira warned her that the journey would not be easy, that the forest would test her in ways she could not imagine, but Marin's resolve was unwavering. Naira led her to the edge of a dark path, a path that seemed to disappear into the mist, and told her that the first trial awaited her. As Marin stepped onto the path, the world around her shifted, and she found herself in a strange place, a realm of shadows and echoes. She could hear voices, whispers from the past, memories of moments she had tried to forget. The first trial was one of the heart, a test of her ability to confront her own fears, her regrets, her insecurities. She saw visions of her family, her friends, the people she had loved and lost, the mistakes she had made, the pain she had buried deep within her heart. She faced each memory, allowing herself to feel the emotions she had long suppressed, and with each confrontation, she felt a weight lift from her soul, as though the forest itself were cleansing her. When she emerged from the trial, she felt lighter, her heart filled with a sense of peace she had never known. The second trial was one of courage. She found herself in a cavern filled with strange, dark shapes, shadows that seemed to move and shift, creatures that watched her with eyes that gleamed in the darkness. She could feel their hostility, their anger, and she knew that they were the spirits of those who had died in the forest, their souls twisted by the curse. But Maren did not waver. She faced the shadows, her heart steady, her spirit unyielding, and as she stood her ground, the creatures began to fade, their anger dissipating, their forms melting back into the mist. She had faced her fear, and the forest had acknowledged her courage. The final trial was one of compassion. She found herself standing before a figure, a young girl, lost and afraid, her eyes filled with tears. Maren recognized her as a spirit, a soul trapped within the wailing wood, a victim of the curse. The girl begged Maren to help her, to free her from the shadows, and Maren, filled with compassion, reached out, embracing the girl, offering her comfort and solace. As she did, she felt a warmth spread through her, a light that seemed to come from within her own soul, and the girl's form faded, her spirit finally finding peace. With the trials completed, Maren returned to the clearing, where Naira awaited her. Naira told her that she had proven herself, that she was worthy of the tear of eternity, and she led Maren to a hidden grove, where the tear rested, its light shining softly in the darkness. Maren reached out and took the tear, feeling its power, its sorrow, its hope. She held it to her heart, and as she did, a wave of energy surged through the forest, breaking the curse, freeing the spirits who had been bound to the shadows for so long. Naira thanked Maren, her eyes filled with gratitude, and as the mist began to lift, she told Maren that she too was free, that her spirit could finally rest. Maren watched as Naira faded into the light, her form dissolving, her soul at peace. As Maren left the forest, the mist lifted, revealing the beauty of the wailing wood, the sunlight filtering through the trees, the sound of birds returning to the branches. She returned to Shadowmere, forever changed, her heart filled with the knowledge that she had fulfilled her destiny, that she had freed the spirits of the wailing wood, and that she had become a part of its legend. And in the town of Shadowmere, the people told stories of Maren, the young woman who had ventured into the wailing wood, who had faced the trials of the forest, and who had broken the curse that had bound it for so long. She became a figure of legend, a symbol of courage and compassion, a reminder of the power of the human spirit to overcome even the darkest of curses. In a distant land surrounded by sprawling plains and shimmering rivers, lay the ancient city of Eldrin's Reach, known for its towering walls and majestic spires that seemed to touch the very sky. Eldrin's Reach was a place of mystery and wonder, built by an ancient race whose knowledge of magic and the arcane arts had surpassed anything known in the world today. The people of Eldrin's Reach lived in awe of the ancient architecture, the statues that lined the streets, and the ruins scattered across the countryside, relics of a time when powerful mages had once walked these lands. But the city was not without its shadows, for beneath the ground, in a labyrinth of tunnels and caverns, lay the remains of a forgotten power, a dark energy that had been sealed away centuries ago, a power that was said to be capable of bending reality itself. The people of Eldrin's Reach had long feared this power, passing down tales of its corrupting influence, its ability to twist the minds of those who sought to control it. The elders warned the young to avoid the ruins, to respect the boundaries set by their ancestors, but there were always those who could not resist the allure of the unknown. Among these was a young scholar named Elandra, a woman whose curiosity often outweighed her caution. She was fascinated by the history of Eldrin's Reach, by the stories of the mages who had wielded unimaginable power, and by the ruins that dotted the landscape, each one hiding secrets that beckoned to her. Elandra spent her days studying ancient texts, piecing together fragments of a forgotten language, decoding the symbols and runes that adorned the walls of the ruins. Her obsession with the past had led her to uncover a forgotten prophecy, one that spoke of a hidden relic known as the Veilstone, a crystal that was said to hold the essence of the ancient power, a force so great that it had been locked away, hidden from the world to prevent it from falling into the wrong hands. The prophecy claimed that only one with the purest intentions could retrieve the Veilstone, that any who sought it for power or greed would be consumed by its darkness. Despite the warnings, Elandra felt a pull, a connection to the Veilstone that she could not explain. She believed that the relic was not merely a source of power, but a key to understanding the ancient world, a chance to unlock knowledge that had been lost for centuries. Driven by a need for answers, she prepared for a journey to the ruins where the Veilstone was said to be hidden, deep within the labyrinth beneath Eldrin's reach. On the night of the full moon, when the stars aligned in a pattern that matched the symbols she had uncovered, Elandra made her way to the entrance of the labyrinth, a hidden door concealed within an ancient statue at the edge of the city. She whispered an incantation, a phrase she had deciphered from the prophecy, and the door opened, revealing a dark, winding stairway that descended into the depths of the earth. As she ventured into the labyrinth, the air grew cold, and the walls seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as though the stones themselves remembered the magic that had once filled these halls. The path twisted and turned, leading her deeper into the darkness, and she could feel the weight of the Veilstone's power pressing down on her, a presence that seemed to watch her every step. The first challenge she faced was one of knowledge. She came to a chamber filled with symbols and runes, each one representing a different aspect of the ancient magic. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, upon which lay a scroll. The scroll contained a riddle, a puzzle that required her to draw upon all she had learned, to understand the symbols and the connections between them. Hours passed as she worked, her mind racing as she pieced together the clues, and finally, the answer came to her, a realization that unlocked a deeper understanding of the ancient language, a knowledge that seemed to flow into her, filling her mind with images of the past. With the riddle solved, a door opened, revealing the next part of the labyrinth. The second challenge was one of courage. She found herself in a cavern filled with shadows, creatures that lurked just beyond the edge of her vision, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. These were the guardians of the Veilstone, spirits bound to protect it from those who would seek it for selfish reasons. As the creatures circled her, Elandra felt a wave of fear wash over her, a primal instinct that urged her to flee, but she stood her ground, refusing to let the shadows intimidate her. She spoke to the creatures, telling them of her quest, of her desire to understand, to learn, not to control or exploit. Her words seemed to resonate with the spirits, and one by one, they faded into the shadows, allowing her to pass. The final challenge was one of the heart. She found herself in a chamber filled with mirrors, each one reflecting a different version of herself, each image showing a path her life could have taken. She saw herself as a powerful mage, as a healer, as a queen, as a wanderer, each reflection representing a choice, a possibility. She felt a pull toward the image of herself as a mage, a figure of power and wisdom, but she knew that this was not her true path. She closed her eyes, focusing on the person she was, the person who sought knowledge for the sake of understanding, and as she did, the mirrors shattered, revealing a door that led to the heart of the labyrinth. Beyond the door lay the Veilstone, a crystal that glowed with a soft, pulsing light, its energy filling the room with a warmth that felt both comforting and overwhelming. Elandra approached the Veilstone, her heart pounding as she reached out, feeling the power radiating from the crystal, a power that seemed to flow into her, filling her mind with visions of the ancient world, of the mages who had created the Veilstone, of the sacrifices they had made to protect it. She saw their faces, their struggles, their triumphs, and she felt a deep connection to them, a kinship that transcended time. She understood now that the Veilstone was not merely a relic, but a part of the ancient mages, a fragment of their souls, their hopes, their dreams. With a heavy heart, she realized that the Veilstone was meant to remain hidden, to protect the world from the power it held, a power that could be as destructive as it was enlightening. Elandra knew that she could not take the Veilstone, that to do so would be to risk the very balance of the world. She placed her hands on the crystal, whispering a prayer of gratitude, a promise to keep its secrets, to honor the sacrifices of those who had come before her. As she did, the Veilstone glowed brighter, its light filling the chamber, and she felt a warmth spread through her, a blessing, a gift from the ancient mages, a knowledge that would stay with her forever. She left the labyrinth, the Veilstone's light guiding her back to the surface, back to the world she had come from. When she emerged from the ruins, the city of Eldrin's Reach lay before her, its towers gleaming in the morning light, and she knew that she had been changed, that she had become a part of the legacy of the ancient mages, a guardian of their knowledge. She returned to her life in Eldrin's Reach, but the experience left her with a deeper understanding, a respect for the mysteries of the past, and a commitment to protect the wisdom she had gained. And though she never spoke of the Veilstone, the people of Eldrin's Reach sensed a change in her, a light in her eyes, a strength in her spirit. Over time, she became a figure of wisdom in the city, a scholar whose knowledge seemed to surpass the limits of human understanding, and the people whispered that she had touched the heart of the ancient magic, that she had glimpsed the secrets of the mages who had built Eldrin's Reach. And as the years passed, the legend of Elandra grew, a tale of a young scholar who had ventured into the depths of the earth, who had faced the challenges of the labyrinth, who had uncovered the knowledge of the ancient mages, and who had returned not with power, but with a deeper understanding, a respect for the mysteries of the past, a guardian of the Veilstone's secrets. In a remote and forgotten corner of the world, hidden by mountains that touched the sky and shrouded in mist so thick that it seemed almost tangible, lay the village of Ashford. To outsiders, Ashford was but a shadow, a place whispered of but rarely seen, for it was as though the mountains themselves protected it, casting a veil between the village and the rest of the world. The people of Ashford lived simple lives, sustained by farming and fishing, and their world revolved around a single, towering tree at the village's center, known as the Elder Tree. The Elder Tree was ancient beyond measure, its trunk wide enough that it would take 5 grown men to wrap their arms around it, and its roots delved deep into the earth, entwining with the rocks and soil of the mountains. Its branches spread far and wide, casting a sheltering shadow over the village, and its leaves glowed with a faint, ethereal light, even in the dead of night. It was said that the Elder Tree was the heart of Ashford, a living being that held within it the memories and wisdom of the generations who had come before. The villagers believed that the tree was a guardian, that it watched over them and protected them from the darkness that lurked beyond the mountains, and so they held it in great reverence. Each year, on the night of the winter solstice, the people of Ashford would gather beneath the Elder Tree for a ritual known as the Night of Whispering Leaves. During this ritual, they would light candles, sing songs of the past, and share stories of their ancestors, believing that on this night, the spirits of those who had passed on would return to the tree, their voices carried on the whispering leaves. But one year, as the Night of Whispering Leaves approached, a strange occurrence unsettled the village. The leaves of the Elder Tree began to fall, turning brittle and brown, littering the ground around its roots. The villagers had never seen the tree shed its leaves in such a way. It was always green, always vibrant, no matter the season. Rumors spread through the village, whispers of an ancient curse, of dark omens, of a sickness that had befallen the tree. The elders were troubled, for they knew the importance of the Elder Tree, not only as a symbol of their heritage, but as a guardian of their village. They feared that if the tree withered and died, so too would the village of Ashford. Among the villagers was a young woman named Lyra, a healer's apprentice who had always felt a strong connection to the Elder Tree. Lyra had grown up listening to her grandmother's stories of the tree, tales of its magic, of the wisdom it held, and she had spent countless hours beneath its branches, feeling a sense of peace and belonging that she found nowhere else. When she saw the leaves falling, her heart ached, for she could not bear the thought of losing the tree that had been such a central part of her life. Determined to find a way to save the Elder Tree, Lyra sought guidance from the village elders, but they could offer her no answers, for they too were at a loss. Desperate, she turned to her grandmother, the village's oldest healer, a woman who was known to possess knowledge of herbs and magic that had been passed down through generations. Her grandmother listened to Lyra's concerns, her weathered face creased with worry, and after a long silence, she revealed to Lyra a tale that had not been spoken of in years. She told her of the heartroot, a mythical root said to lie at the base of the Elder Tree, hidden deep within the earth. The heartroot was believed to be the source of the tree's life, a fragment of ancient magic that connected the tree to the very soul of the world. But long ago, a darkness had seeped into the heartroot, a curse that had been placed upon it by a being of great malice, and though the tree had endured for centuries, the curse had never been fully lifted. Her grandmother told Lyra that if the heartroot were to be cleansed, the curse broken, the Elder Tree might be saved. But such a task was dangerous, for it required a journey into the heart of the tree itself, through tunnels and caverns that were filled with shadows, guarded by creatures that had been drawn to the heartroot's power. Lyra felt a surge of determination, for she knew that she could not stand by and watch the Elder Tree wither and die. She resolved to find the heartroot, to cleanse it, to lift the curse that had plagued it for so long. Her grandmother warned her of the dangers, urging her to be cautious, to rely on her instincts, to remember the teachings of the healers, and Lyra promised to heed her advice. Armed with herbs for protection, a small lantern to guide her through the darkness, and a vial of sacred water blessed by the village elders, Lyra made her way to the base of the Elder Tree. As she approached, she felt a strange energy in the air, a feeling of anticipation, as though the tree itself knew of her intentions. She placed her hand on the bark, whispering a prayer for guidance, and as she did, she felt a warmth spread through her, a silent encouragement that strengthened her resolve. She found a narrow passage hidden among the roots, a tunnel that descended into the earth, leading her deeper into the tree's heart. The air grew colder as she ventured down, the walls lined with twisting roots that seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie glow. She followed the path, her footsteps echoing in the silence, until she reached a cavern where the roots converged, forming a tangled mass around a pool of dark, still water. In the center of the pool lay the heartroot, a twisted, gnarled root that pulsed with a dark energy, its surface covered in strange, pulsating veins that seemed to writhe beneath the light of her lantern. As she approached, she felt a wave of nausea, a sense of dread that made her heart race, for she could feel the malevolent energy emanating from the root, a darkness that seemed to reach out, seeking to ensnare her. Summoning her courage, Lyra took out the vial of sacred water, pouring it onto the heartroot, chanting an incantation her grandmother had taught her. As the water touched the root, it hissed and steamed, the darkness recoiling, writhing in agony. But the darkness was strong, and it fought back, lashing out with tendrils of shadow that wrapped around her, filling her mind with visions of despair, of loss, of hopelessness. She could feel herself slipping, her strength waning, but she remembered her grandmother's words, the stories of the tree, the connection she felt to it, and she fought back, focusing on the light within her heart, a warmth that pushed against the darkness. She continued the chant, her voice growing stronger, and as she did, the darkness began to fade, its grip loosening, the shadows retreating. Finally, with one last surge of energy, the darkness shattered, dissolving into nothingness, and the heartroot began to glow with a soft, warm light, its surface smooth and unblemished. The curse had been lifted, and the energy of the heartroot flowed through the roots, up into the tree, filling it with new life. Lyra felt a warmth spread through the cavern, a feeling of peace and healing, and she knew that the elder tree had been saved. She made her way back to the surface, and as she emerged from the tunnel, she saw that the tree's leaves had returned to their vibrant green, the branches swaying gently in the wind, as though in gratitude. The people of Ashford gathered around her, their faces filled with wonder and relief, and they celebrated Lyra's bravery, her determination, her connection to the tree that had saved them all. And as the night of whispering leaves began, the villagers told the story of Lyra, the young healer who had ventured into the heart of the elder tree, who had faced the darkness that threatened to consume it, who had saved the village of Ashford from a fate that had seemed inevitable. They spoke of her courage, her wisdom, her compassion, and they knew that she had become a part of the tree's legacy, a guardian of its secrets, a symbol of the strength and resilience of the people of Ashford. And so, with the tree restored, the village continued to thrive, the people living in harmony with the land, forever grateful to the young woman who had saved them. And the elder tree stood tall, its branches sheltering the village, its roots entwined with the mountains, a silent guardian that watched over them, a reminder of the power of hope and the strength of the human spirit. The city of Eloria lay nestled between the shores of the Crystal Sea and the vast expanse of the Erythian forest, its white stone walls gleaming in the sunlight. Eloria was a city known for its beauty and for the arts it nurtured. Musicians, poets, and scholars came from distant lands to study in its halls, for the city was a place where knowledge and creativity were treasured above all else. But it was also a place of mystery, for hidden deep within the heart of Eloria was a secret, a relic that held a power so great that only a handful of people knew of its existence. This relic was known as the Crystal of Memories, a gemstone the size of a man's fist, hidden away in the library of the Arcanum, the oldest building in Eloria, built when the city was young and its founders had sought to create a place of wisdom and learning. The Crystal of Memories was no ordinary gemstone. It was said to contain the knowledge and experiences of everyone who had ever lived in Eloria, a vast repository of thoughts and emotions, a living history that could only be accessed by those who understood its mysteries. But it was also a dangerous artifact, for if someone with impure intentions attempted to use it, the crystal would corrupt their mind, filling them with madness. The crystal had been kept safe for centuries, guarded by the keepers of the Arcanum, an ancient order sworn to protect Eloria's secrets. The keepers lived humble lives, dedicated to preserving the wisdom of the past and ensuring that the knowledge of the crystal would never fall into the wrong hands. One of these keepers was a young man named Finian, an apprentice who had spent his life studying the history of Eloria, learning the stories of its people, memorizing the songs and legends that had been passed down through the generations. Finian was a curious soul, always asking questions, always seeking to understand more. And though he respected the traditions of the keepers, he could not help but wonder about the crystal of memories. He had heard the stories, the whispered tales of its power, and he longed to see it, to understand what secrets it held. His mentor, an elderly keeper named Alaric, had warned him against such thoughts, reminding him that the crystal was not something to be tampered with, that its power was both a blessing and a curse. But Finian's curiosity was a flame that could not be extinguished, and one night, when the city was asleep and the halls of the Arcanum were silent, he made his way to the chamber where the crystal was kept. The door was locked, but he had learned the old ways, the chants and the symbols that would open the ancient locks. And as he stepped into the chamber, he felt a sense of awe and fear, for before him lay the crystal of memories, its surface glowing with a faint, pulsing light. He reached out, his hand trembling, and as he touched the crystal, he felt a rush of energy, a flood of memories that filled his mind. He saw the lives of the people of Aloria, their joys and sorrows, their hopes and fears, a tapestry of emotions and experiences that stretched back through the ages. But as he delved deeper, he felt something dark, a presence that lurked within the crystal, a shadow that seemed to watch him waiting. He tried to pull away, but he was trapped, his mind entwined with the memories, unable to escape. The shadow grew stronger, filling him with despair, with visions of destruction and chaos, and he realized that he had awoken something within the crystal, a darkness that had been waiting, biding its time. In his panic, he called out to Alaric, his voice echoing through the chamber, and moments later his mentor appeared, his face filled with horror as he saw Finian entangled in the crystal's power. Alaric rushed forward, chanting an incantation, a prayer of protection, and slowly, the darkness receded, releasing its hold on Finian. He collapsed to the floor, his body trembling, his mind filled with fragments of memories, images that he could not understand. Alaric helped him to his feet, his voice stern but filled with concern, warning him of the dangers of the crystal, of the price that must be paid for knowledge, for understanding. Finian listened, humbled and shaken, and as he looked into his mentor's eyes, he realized that the crystal of memories was not merely a relic, but a living entity, a vessel of knowledge that carried within it both light and darkness. Over time, Finian learned to respect the crystal, to understand that some secrets were meant to remain hidden, that some knowledge was too great, too dangerous for one person to possess. He dedicated himself to the keepers, to the protection of Aloria's wisdom, and as he grew older, he became a guardian of the crystal, a protector of the city's past. The people of Aloria never knew of the dangers that had nearly befallen them, of the darkness that lurked within the crystal, waiting for someone to unlock its secrets. They continued to live their lives, creating music, writing poetry, studying the stars, blissfully unaware of the power that lay hidden in the heart of their city. And Finian watched over them, his mind forever marked by the memories he had glimpsed, his heart filled with a silent resolve to protect them from the knowledge that could destroy them. He knew now that the crystal of memories was not a treasure to be coveted, but a burden to be carried, a responsibility that he would bear for the rest of his days, a guardian of Aloria's secrets, a keeper of its past.